I rise today in support of the motion by the Honourable Member for Trinity Spadina that, in the opinion of this House, door-to-door delivery of regular mail is a valuable service provided by Canada Post, and that this House express its opposition to Canada becoming the only country in the G7 without such a service. Mr. Speaker, it should be the opinion of this House that door-to-door delivery of regular mail is a valuable service provided by Canada Post, but it is the opinion of the overwhelming majority of the constituents of St. John's South Mount Pearl in my province of Newfoundland and Labrador. How do I know that, Mr. Speaker? Because I asked them. That's a novel idea, Mr. Speaker, asking Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, asking Canadians what they think. That's not what happened with these changes to Canada Post. The Crown Corporation carried out consultations by invitation only with comments submitted beforehand. In other words, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a public process. A public process involves the public. But the public, by and large, was forgotten. The public, Mr. Speaker, was ignored. There was consultation, Mr. Speaker, with the Conservative government. The changes at Canada Post were announced on December the 11th, the day after the House of Commons closed for the fall session. Do you think that's a coincidence, Mr. Speaker, that Canada Post announces the elimination of home delivery, the termination of 6,000 to 8,000 jobs, raises the price of a stamp by up to $1, and cuts the hours of rural post offices the day after the House closes? So there's no discussion, no debate, there's no questions, and there are no answers, Mr. Speaker. Do you believe in coincidence? Not with this Conservative government, Mr. Speaker. Sidestepping democracy is this government's modus operandi. Not only was the public not widely consulted, Mr. Speaker, but this House, the people's representatives, weren't consulted either. Beyond that, the minister responsible for Canada Post released one written statement in support of the cuts and then refused to answer any questions. Period. Could it be that the minister is taking the time to write us all a letter about the changes to Canada Post? Writing us a letter? Not likely, Mr. Speaker. Not likely, given the price of a stamp. After the changes to Canada Post were handed down, the Chief Executive Officer said that seniors were happy enough to lose home delivery because it will give them an opportunity to exercise, an opportunity to get fit. The CEO has obviously never had to climb the summit of a snowbank in front of a super mailbox and use a blowtorch to unfreeze the keyhole to get the mail, which is how one senior put it to me. The seniors and disabled I consulted, Mr. Speaker, in my riding of St. John's South Mount Pearl, didn't mention exercise as a plus to the cancellation of home delivery. Not one, Mr. Speaker. Not one. They brought up questions like how they'll get their mail in the snow and the ice and the sleet and the slush and the horizontal rain and when it's blowing a gale. They brought up those questions, Mr. Speaker. A public meeting was held in mid-January in my riding, a meeting organized by the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. And I'm going to read some of the quotes that I took down from that meeting, Mr. Speaker. Quote, "Home delivery is our right. Do not put me in danger by forcing me to a super mailbox. And as for seniors needing our exercise, yes, we do. And we're going to get it in the next election." End quote. That means they're not going to be voting Conservative, Mr. Speaker, in case it wasn't obvious. Another quote, quote, "What should happen is they should scrap the Senate and save our post office." Interesting idea, Mr. Speaker. Another quote, "Unless I become Superwoman and learn how to fly, I won't be receiving any mail between December and April." Now, that quote, Mr. Speaker, is from a disabled woman in St. John's and a member of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. Here's a quote from Ralph Morse. He's president of the Pensioners Association of Newfoundland and Labrador. Quote, "For seniors, direct deposit of checks should mean at the post office located at their front door." How about a quote from a young person, Mr. Speaker? Quote, "My generation isn't expecting less. We're going to demand more." Now, those quotes were from the public meeting, and a lively public meeting it was, Mr. Speaker. Let me read you an example of some of the mail that my office has received. Quote, I live in St. John's in a 50-plus condominium. Like several people here, I have a mobility problem. This curtails my walking any distance, and if it is very windy or in the winter there's snow and ice, I am unable to walk anywhere. I do not have a car, and there are several people in the condominium here who no longer drive. With the new plans for mail to be no longer delivered to one's home, I wonder how will I obtain my mail? That's a good question, Mr. Speaker. And another comment. This is actually a question, Mr. Speaker. Would you please ask Canada Post if they're going to deliver my mail during the winter, as I am unable to go and get it? The CEO has no idea what I want or need unless he asks me, and that was not done. End quote. Mr. Speaker, I've gone out of my way to use as many quotes in this speech as possible. Mr. Speaker, I've done that because there was such limited consultation and the Conservatives need to be delivered a message. This past Saturday, Mr. Speaker, I organized a petition blitz in Mount Pearl. Dozens of volunteers spent 2.5 hours knocking on doors asking people to sign the petition. Now, the petition calls on the Government of Canada to reverse the cuts to services recently announced to Canada Post and to look instead for ways to modernize operations. At the end, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the 2.5-hour blitz, we had gathered more than 1,400 signatures, Mr. Speaker. The response was absolutely overwhelming. People don't want to lose their home delivery. Not a single one of the 1,400 people thanked Canada Post for the opportunity to get more exercise. Not one, Mr. Speaker. The municipal councils in St. John's, in Mount Pearl, and Petty Harbour, all within my riding, also agreed to carry the petitions in their municipal offices. Now, here's a quote from the Mayor of St. John's, Dennis O'Keefe, who's also vehemently against the cuts. Quote, the elimination of home delivery and the exorbitant increase in postal rates will impact severely on all residents of St. John's, and in particular on seniors and those with disabilities. Canada Post and the Conservative government need to recommit to their responsibility of government to provide a public service. Key words, Mr. Speaker. Public service. Newfoundlanders and Labradorians in general, those who live in urban areas, and Canadians across the country, they don't want to lose home delivery service, a treasured service that they've enjoyed for decades, while at the same time, Mr. Speaker, paying more for postage. The management plan at Canada Post seems to be to eliminate services, raising prices, and cut jobs. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's no way to modernize operations at Canada Post. That's no way to manage Canada Post. Mr. Speaker, there seems to be a problem at the very top. The Prime Minister appointed Deepak Chopra months before the lockout in 2011 with a salary of $500,000 a year and a 33% bonus. 5 months after the CEO was appointed, Canada Post cut drug coverage and other benefits to all employees, including those on sick leave and those on disability. And then they cut back on services to the public, Mr. Speaker. Canada Post made a profit of $1.7 billion in 16 of the last 17 years. The one year they didn't make a profit was the year that Canada Post locked out its employees. There is a crisis within Canada Post, Mr. Speaker. It is an invented crisis. It is a crisis of management. Is change inevitable? Yes, Mr. Speaker. Yes, it is. The number of letters may be down. That's undeniable with social media and with the Internet. But the number of packages is up. Are there other opportunities for Canada Post? Postal banking, for example. Yes, Mr. Speaker, there are. Were Canadians consulted? No, they were not. New Democrats want to protect home delivery, improve services, attract new customers, and raise revenues for Canada Post. That's what we want, Mr. Speaker. But announcing changes with little or no input from Canadians, announcing changes after the House of Commons closes, the day after it closes, telling seniors to swallow the changes and get more exercise, that's not the Canadian way, Mr. Speaker. No, Mr. Speaker, it's not the Canadian way. That's the Conservative way. And, Mr. Speaker, it's on the way out. Thank you.